into the room, the rate of obedience dropped to 45%. When the guy actually sat next to the real subject, and the real subject had to actually put his hand on a shock plate, the rate of obedience dropped to 20%. And it was statistically significant. And what this tells us, a very important principle, which we can see in the real world, it's much harder for people to harm others when they're directly confronted with the consequences of their actions. So proximity to the victim is one of the variables. Another set of variables which are among the scariest and the most optimistic, the two opposite ends of the spectrum. When the actual subject didn't have to flip the switch himself, and in most cases, in all but one variation, it was men, so I'm saying him. When all he did was pass on information to another person who actually pulled the switch. So he wasn't actually flipping the toggle switch, but he was part of the process. The rate of obedience increased to 92.5%.
Wow.
37 out of 40. And in fact, Peter Gabriel did a song about that particular variation. He called it Milgram's 37.
Huh.
And that's pretty scary, and that reflects real life. When people are part of the chain, you know, a cog in the wheel, it's much easier to go along with authority. I didn't pull a switch, it wasn't me.
I just told him to.
Yeah, I just told him to. That's exactly right.
I was just following orders.
I was just following orders.
To tell him to pull the switch.
That's right. But on the opposite end, there was one positive result in the experiments. In another variation, when two other people who were supposedly part of the experiment dropped out, then the real subject also was much more likely to drop out. Having people who are willing to speak up and say, no, I'm not going to do this, does have an effect.
Very important. So it's important that we question authority.
Well, as I said, authorities aren't always moral, and experts aren't always right.
So how can we be more critical of authority, authority figures?
In the book that I'm writing, I talk about some of these factors that I call a seduction of the situation. What are some of the things that are going on that lure you into going along with the authority? So that's one of the things, be aware. For example, and this is based on research, this isn't just my speculation, the power of a uniform or dress. There's been a number of interesting experiments on that. One done by a student of Milgram's who went out on the streets of Brooklyn, and the setup was that he would go up to people and say that there's a car parked at an expired meter, would you put some money in the meter? It was a kind of odd request in Brooklyn, but what he varied was what he was wearing when he made the request. One, he's wearing ordinary street clothes. Another, he was wearing a security guard's uniform that looked a lot like the NYPD. And then in the third variation, he was wearing a milkman's uniform. It's when they still had home delivery of milk. You can see how dated that is. Now, people probably wouldn't be surprised to find out that the rate of compliance was greater when the guy was wearing the security uniform. But it was also greater when he was wearing the milkman's uniform.
Wow.
Now, what has the milkman got to do with whether you should put money in the meter? Absolutely nothing. But the uniform, a former student of mine did some variations with having the person wearing a business suit. And he got a greater rate of compliance when wearing a business suit than ordinary clothes. So people respond to what the authority is wearing.
So a lot of people don't even know or recognize that they're being manipulated. That's
right. Even with the uniforms, because in the case of the business suit or whatever, there are a lot of subtle things that can make a difference. The way that the authority presents himself, the language that's used, which is something that we can turn around and use to our advantage too, but in a very authoritative manner. And the authorities will look at you when they are talking, but when you are talking to them, they're more likely to look away. There are lots of very subtle nonverbal things that do. And it's not necessarily that the authorities do it intentionally, although they may, but they are subtle things that establish their authority that can have an unconscious effect on people. So we talked about another thing that people are affected by to a much greater degree than they realize is attractive appearance, whether it's male or female. Now, there's a huge amount of research on interpersonal attraction. I mean, even little kids will respond more favorably to someone who is attractive by society's standards. Attractive people are judged to be smarter, happier, more moral. Which, if you think about it, is pretty ridiculous.
Yeah.
But we do. People are seduced, pardon the expression in this context.
Is there some built-in, hardwired, evolutionary reason for that you can figure that?
It depends on which psychologist you talk to. I'm not sure there's a universal consensus on that. I'm skeptical of lots of the claims of built-in hardwire because human behavior is extremely complex, and actually our evolutionary nature is to have a cerebral cortex that is so malleable, so plastic, that we can do what very few other animals could do. We can learn, we can change. So I'm not very enthusiastic about the hardwired argument. There's too much evidence of the impact of environmental, geographical, social, cultural factors on human behavior. And in the long run, I think that's probably a much larger part of the equation. Because there are societies, there have been societies that have been, for example, non-aggressive. We tend to think of aggression as something built into human behavior, but there are peaceful, non-aggressive societies. And there are societies that where men and women are fairly equal. There are a lot of variations in human behavior that are different than what we see in modern-day America. So it's hard to say that too many things are really hardwired in.
So you think that this is something that's taught. Now, how can I resist or stand up to authority without incurring the wrath of those authority figures?
Well, I think that you...
I mean, if they're in a position to harm me, if they really are an authority figure, generally, I mean, we all encounter people that give us orders, you know, who believe they can, and they just do. And it's considered a form of rudeness, at least in America, which is of some hope, a hopeful thing as well. But if the person really does have the authority to harm me, okay, or is given to them by society, sometimes mistakenly, how can I best resist that person without incurring their wrath?
Well, I think you have to be smart about it, unless you have some good reason to be a martyr. And I've known people who want to go in the face of authority, and you know, probably not the most effective way to deal with it. I think we have to talk about what kind of situation we're talking about. If a policeman stops you, frankly, you're going to have to show him your license unless you want to go to jail. Well, okay, fine. But there aren't necessarily a lot of consequences of that sort of thing. That is, giving him the license, no terrible thing is going to happen. But you have to ask yourself whether what the authority is doing is asking you to do something that violates your conscience, which is unfortunately the question that people did not ask themselves in Nazi Germany, or some did, and there certainly were resistors.
But most of them ended up dead.
Many of the resistors did end up dead. So in a situation where your choice is to go along or die, it's not for me to say be a martyr. I think what's more interesting is to talk about situations where, well, I mean, actually libertarians, of course, have a lot to say about how to slide around authority, but that's not really what my book's about. I'm really trying to deal with how do you effectively confront